Okay. Look, I know. It's been probably about 2 months since my last episode, but I've been planning a lot of episodes. I've written a number of drafts for things I've got planned, and I've been busy as all hell. So cut a guy some slack. Anyways, here's the first part of a two-part episode. We're going to be looking at Metallica. Now, this is always a source of contention in the metal community, and I think this will help metal fans to get a bit of a perspective on Metallica and understand what's been going on with the band for the last decade or so. So, I'll bet by now you've heard at least a sample of the latest offering from Metallica called Lulu, which features Velvet Underground singer Lou Reed. The divide on this record seems pretty clear-cut. Metallica fans hate it. Lou Reed fans are on the fence. No one knows what to make of the strange album. Even the label wasn't sure how to market it, and all of the rock stations I listen to aren't touching Lulu with a 40-foot pole. So the question remains, what the hell happened to Metallica? Lulu's a far cry from Master of Puppets or even Load. This obviously isn't a new phenomena for longtime fans. At least once, if not several times in the band's history, fans and critics alike have wondered what to make of the mighty Metallica. In this two-part episode, we're going to look at Metallica's past history to set a context for why this album came about and if we can expect any sort of return to their glory days in the future. So let's start at the beginning. Metallica was formed in 1981 in LA by drummer Lars Ulrich and guitarist James Hetfield. Lars had spent the previous summer in the UK indulging in a new metal movement sweeping England, which retroactively became known as the new wave of British heavy metal. Lars spent some time following around members of Diamond Head on tour, and rumor has it he even tried out for the band. When he got back to LA, he met local metal fan and record shop employee Brian Slagle, who wanted to put together a compilation of underground LA metal bands. You might recognize the name Brian Slagle as the CEO of Metal Blade Records, one of the most important heavy metal labels in the history of the genre. He told Lars of the time that if he could get a band together, he could have a spot on the compilation. Interesting side note, Rat, Steeler, which was Yngwie's first band, Malice, and Black and Blue would all make their debuts on this compilation. This led to Lars putting an advertisement in a local newspaper called The Recycler, in which he said he was a drummer looking to start a metal band influenced by Diamond Head, Tigers of Pantang, and Iron Maiden. James Hetfield saw the ad and called up Lars. The two hit it off immediately and penned the classic tune, Hit the Lights. The original recording of Hit the Lights would feature a guitar solo by Lloyd Grant. The track became something of an underground sensation, and Metal Massacre quickly went out of print. Metallica got a steady lineup together with future Megadeth main man Dave Mustaine on lead guitar and Ron McGovney on bass. Ron, although not an immensely talented bassist, would serve as the band's father figure and help to keep them together during their initial year. Ron would be the one renting the van, driving it, and having to keep a watch over the other guys while the rest of Metallica got drunk and acted stupid. Nonetheless, they soon wrote several songs and released one of the most important demos in metal history, No Life to Leather. San Francisco tape trader Ron Quintana played a major role in helping to spread the tape to whoever would listen. When the band played San Francisco a few months later, they discovered they had a massive following, with the audience singing every word. It was in San Fran that Metallica saw a tall, hippie-ish bass virtuoso playing a distorted bass in a band called Trauma, and his name was Cliff Burton. They knew immediately they needed him for Metallica, and he agreed to join them if they relocated to San Francisco. With little going for them in LA, except for other glam metal bands, Metallica knew they had to make the move. And after a year of putting up with Metallica's immaturity and bullshit, McGovney was given his walking papers. Metallica would spend a couple more months gigging and honing their music. Cliff, who had a background in music theory and harmony, began to teach the other members of Metallica the inner workings of music. This education would be part of the reason why Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets are so rich with melodic textures in the guitar and bass playing. From here, you know the score. Metallica would go on to kick out Dave Mustaine and replace him with Exodus guitarist Kirk Hammett just before the recording of Kill 'Em All. Metallica would go on to release three of the most seminal metal albums the world has ever known: Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, and Master of Puppets. Each album saw the band progress as songwriters, musicians, and in production values. By 1986, Metallica's rise to the top seemed inevitable. They were so good live, they were blowing Ozzy Osbourne off the stage nightly, despite having Jakey Lee on guitar. And then, tragedy struck. In the early morning of September 28, 1986, while on tour in Sweden, Metallica's tour bus supposedly hit a patch of black ice, which caused the bus to topple over sideways. Cliff Burton had been sleeping with an open window and was thrown out of the bus, which then landed on top of him. Later investigations showed that the skid marks from the crash are often seen after those who've fallen asleep at the wheel, but the driver was found not at fault. As you can imagine, this sent shockwaves through the Metallica camp and indeed the heavy metal world. Cliff, while not Metallica's leader per se, was wise beyond his years, and his influence in both writing and the group dynamic was absolutely vital to the successes of the first 3 albums. Unsure of what to do, Metallica quickly sent out a silent memo that they were in search of a bassist. A number of musicians would audition, including Joey Vera of Armored Saint, but they would eventually land on the bassist of Flotsam and Jetsam, Jason Newsted. He proved a worthy successor to Cliff and was a massive Metallica fan. Supposedly, when he came to audition, he knew every single song Metallica played. But given the recent death of Cliff, Jason would never become a fully accepted member of Metallica, despite playing on 5+ albums with them, a number of live recordings, and touring for well over a decade. Some have argued that this shift in Metallica gave Lars and James unprecedented power when it came to making band decisions. Cliff was often respected and looked upon for his creative input and thoughts. Jason, however, as far as I can tell, was never treated as an equal, and a lot of his songwriting ideas were completely overlooked. After looking through Metallica's entire discography, Cliff has more songwriting credits than Newsted, despite playing on only 3 albums. To add insult to injury, when it came time to mix their next album, the critically acclaimed And Justice for All, Metallica all but mixed Newsted out of the album. With the subsequent releases of the video One on MTV and the Monsters of Rock tour, Metallica's rise to superstardom seemed just a matter of time. After hearing the brilliantly produced Dr. Feelgood album from Motley Crue, Metallica contacted Bob Rock. They would spend over a year recording what would become the biggest selling album of the last 20 years and the primary reason your grandmother, mom, and aunt know the name Metallica, the Black Album. In recent years, this album has become a source of contention among many fans, although I think it's partly because radio has played Enter Sandman and Nothing Else Matters to death. Personally, I still find it to be one of their best albums to date. They've never released a better sounding album sonically, James has never sung better, Kirk's leads are memorable, and Holier Than Thou and Sad But True hold up against anything they've released. Skip ahead 5 years to the release of Load in 1996, and we see Metallica sporting a drastically different look. Their hair was cut, their logo modified, and their sound had become a mixture of heavy metal, grunge, and alternative. The Load and Reload albums were made for radio, and you could tell Metallica had been paying attention to bands like Pearl Jam and Soundgarden at that time. I still quite enjoy the Load album, but I find Reload has too many throwaway songs. Many fans aren't crazy about this period of the band, as Metallica sounds drastically different than anything they did in the 1980s. Still, if you put the best songs from Load and Reload together, I think you'd have a pretty solid album, even if not necessarily a solid Metallica album. Now, returning to Cliff for just a minute, it's interesting to speculate, and this should only be treated as speculation, whether if Cliff had remained alive, whether Metallica would have ever recorded an album like Load or Reload. At the time of his death, Cliff's musical interests were very diverse. He was a big fan of R.E.M., the Misfits, Southern rock, and classical music. Would Metallica have ever given in to the prevailing rock music climate at the time? Or would Cliff have been a huge Pearl Jam fan? Or would Metallica have stuck to their guns and released Master of Puppets Part 4? We'll never know for sure, but it sure is interesting to speculate, and for fans who hold on to the notion that Cliff would have kept Metallica true, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. Just some food for thought anyways. In 1998, Metallica went back to their roots. They released a double album of covers, one disc newly recorded and the other largely recorded during several sessions in the 1980s, which included their Garage Days EP. Personally, this is perhaps my favorite Metallica album, even though it contains no original material. That's not to say at all that I don't love Master of Puppets, Ride the Lightning, the Black Album, and so on, but this showcases one of my favorite periods of metal, which is often forgotten. This is known as a new wave of British heavy metal. Diamond Head, Motorhead, Sweet Savage, Blitzkrieg, Savage, and even Holocaust all have tracks on this disc. This album is really special to me because it served as my gateway into this incredible period of music and led me to discover a number of bands that I still love to this day, including Jaguar, Dark Star, Mithra, and many others. A year later, Metallica would then undertake something very unique for the time. With composer Michael Kamen, Metallica released a 2-disc live album of a symphony playing alongside Metallica. The album was a smash success, both in terms of sales and critically. What do you expect from Metallica? Everything they've done in the past 20 years has been a success, with one exception. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. For the next episode, we're going to look at the past decade or so of Metallica, Lulu, and where the band might be headed. So make sure to stay tuned for that, and I hope to have it up before New Year's. Stay tuned.